Welcome to the EarthWorks podcast, where our team will share the jargon of carbon from many of our turf friends from the past 30 years.
Hi, everybody. I'm Joel Simmons, and this is the EarthWorks podcast. And I am very happy to say that we have our dear friend, our chemist, our brain trust, Lawrence Mayhew, back with us. By popular demand, by the way, Lawrence. I've had a lot of people say, man, I really like listening to Lawrence, even though I don't understand what the hell he's talking about, which is true for us as well. And I think I've said this on the podcast a number of times. Here at EarthWorks, the agronomy team gets the opportunity to spend probably an hour plus with Lawrence every Monday morning as we do our Monday morning briefings. And we've learned to record all those Zoom calls that we're doing with Lawrence because we can't get past the first couple words. It just there's a lot to absorb. So we wanted to kind of get back with you, Lawrence, and do some review. For those of you who haven't listened to any of Lawrence's podcasts with us in years past or weeks past, months past, we get Lawrence on quite often, actually, which is great. Lawrence is generally recognized as a world-renowned humic substance expert, and we're going to review humic substances and talk about that. And he encouraged me yesterday because he was talking about some work he's doing on some not so real humic substances. But Lawrence, let's get into a little bit of review. I mean, we've talked about humic substances. I think it's the one question, if I were to quiz anybody in a Soils First Academy, what is a humate and what do they do? I would be willing to bet still that most people are not completely fully aware of the benefits of a humic substance in the kind of programs that we are putting out into the turf and ornamental and even into the agriculture community. But give us a nickel tour of what's the great benefits of humic substances in a soil and in a turf program.
In soils, they provide the conditions for microbiological activity to take place, and the microbes exchange nutrients with plant roots. The plant roots in return will put out exudates to feed the microbiological activity, which is actually enhanced in the presence of humic substances. So if you take away all the humic substances out of a soil, you have a very light color because they're very dark colored materials. You have a very light colored soil, i.e. sand.
Right, which we deal a lot with in our industry.
I think you guys know a little bit about sand.
We know sand, yeah.
Yeah. Humic substances in a agronomic program or fertilizer program are intended to actually increase the efficiency or the effective use of inputs, primarily N, P, and K and micronutrients. And how do they do that? Well, they do it through chemistry and biology. So they are not simple compounds. They're the most complex carbonaceous compounds on the face of the earth. So their complexity causes a lot of issues with trying to understand what they are. And there's a scientific group called the International Humic Substances Society that studies these materials. And they have been responsible for increasing the knowledge of these materials. And still to this day, they're very confusing. They're very controversial. It's difficult to get scientists to agree exactly what they are and where they came from. So
we even have countries that won't allow humate. I mean, is Canada still fighting us on humic acids? Humic substances, excuse me?
Canada's okay. The organic standards for crop production nationally really changed the attitude toward these substances because they became federally approved in organic programs. So most states, countries like Canada, pretty well recognize that they play a very important role in agricultural production, in some cases, very necessary roles. So they are well recognized now and a little bit better defined. Trying to define them is so difficult because if you hear the word humic acids, that you would think that's a substance, wouldn't you? Something you can wrap your head around. Okay, the definition of a humic acids. Notice I always use the plural because they are a continuum of materials. They're not just simply a substance. These materials are extracted with alkaline sodium hydroxide, potassium hydroxide. Then they're acidified, usually using hydrochloric acid, and they literally drop out of solution. And the stuff that drops out of the solution are called humic acids. So obviously they're not an acid. That's got to make things confusing.
Yeah, you confused us to no end on that word. So technically,
I know it's operationally defined, just like organic matter. No, soil organic matter, for example, is operationally defined. How do they put in a soil organic matter number on your soil report? By what's called LOI, loss on ignition. Yeah. So they measure the loss. They measure the loss upon ignition of a soil, and the difference between what they started with and what they ended with is called organic matter. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you absolutely nothing. So that's kind of where humic substances are.
So technically, we should be using the phrase humic substances in this conversation as opposed to humic acids. Although I think we're arguing semantics. I think everybody kind of understands that. Let's stay with this concept of people understanding it. I mean, I know we as a company, and I think anybody trying to register products with humic acid still go through a gyration. And now what we're finding is it's about the testing protocol. In particular, state of California is very adamant about a very specific testing protocol that I think you've shared with us is not even a valid test according to the International Humic Standards or the Humic Products Trade Association, the HPTA. So help me understand that a little bit better.
California has a test that they use called the California Department of Food and Agriculture method, CDFA method. If you want to claim you have humic acids in your product. However, the test was developed to extract humic acids from soils. So it's an extraction technique, and it's never been validated for quantitative analysis because it's flawed for that purpose, primarily because it's done in the atmosphere where things can oxidize and add to that humic acid report number. And it includes iron and calcium and magnesium and silicon in that humic acid report. So the HPTA, the Humic Products Trade Association, spent 6 years developing a method that's ash-free and performed in a nitrogen atmosphere in the laboratory instead of oxygen atmosphere.
Explain ash-free, just so we understand that a little bit better.
Ash-free is any mineral that's in, let's say, a soil. If you ash a soil sample, the minerals, everything will burn off. The organic matter will burn off. And the only thing left behind is ash. That ash are minerals. That's exactly. So
it's like taking a log in your fire. What you're burning is the carbon of the wood. And what you have in the fire pit when the fire is over is the ash, which is really the mineral content of that carbon mineral complex. And since minerals don't burn to the extent that carbon does, there is an ash content. It's funny because forever when we got into this business, I remember we would get criticized for saying, oh, well, there's a lot of ash in this organic fertilizer. And we kept saying, yes, there is.
I sure hope so.
That's the whole idea. We want the minerals. We're trying to remineralize the soil. But I remember.
The most common ash in your example of burning a log is potash.
Potassium, right? Exactly. So there's a lot of mineral and remineralization, and I don't want to go down that road too far. But let's stay with this testing protocol and the perception of humates.
Well, there's only one scientifically validated testing method for determining the quantity of humic acids and a portion of formic acids. We've only been able to isolate a part of the fulvic acids using this method, and it's called the ISO 19822. If a laboratory can perform ISO 19822, that is a valid quantitative analysis for humic substances.
As established by the International Humate Institute and HPTA. Who's this determined?
Well, HPTA sponsored the research that was required to get that ISO international standard.
Okay. So it is an international standard based on work done by chemists all over the world.
Right. I directed the study, and we enlisted about 12 labs globally that participated in that.
So talk to me about, we've done this on our morning meetings. And I don't mean, and I certainly won't bring anybody's names into this, but we see a lot of labels in the industry, and many of them will say, 50% humic acids or 70% humic acids, or even 25% humic acid. And, we've shared these labels with you, and you've repeatedly said that's impossible. Explain what is happening in labeling of commercial products when it comes to a humic acid for us, please.
Well, there's a lot of flawed analyses out there, and a company will send a sample to numerous labs, whichever one gives them the largest number. That's the one they put on the label. So, yes. Now, if you send your sample to a lab that performs the validated test, the ISO 19822, you'll probably get back the lowest numbers.
Yeah.
More than likely.
That would be us.
Because it's age-free, it's a legitimate, it's a validated number. It's been scientifically proven to be, can't use the word accurate, precise is the technical term.
Yeah.
Precision has been validated on that test.
So, I mean, you've shared this with us, and in some ways confused us in a lot of fashions. I mean, it's not necessarily saying that these are wrong. It's just they're using a different test methodology. But to really get a qualified humic acid percentage, I mean, you're really not looking at a big, and quite honestly, from what you've taught us over the years, we really don't want a huge percentage of humic substances or humic acids in these types of products. And I'm referring mostly to liquid fertilizer products. But, we've seen numbers of labs. There was one that we were looking at. I don't remember. It said derived from humus. There was one I should have brought it with me. It was another really strange one that was talking about the way the humates are formed, and you would respond to us as that's just impossible, and it's consistent, but still the states are allowing them to register. Explain that one to me. Help me with that one.
Well, all of the state regulators, fertilizer regulators, belong to a group called APCO. That's the Association of American Plant Food Control Officials. With that group meets every 6 months, various places in the United States, every 6 months. One of the committees that meets is called the Laboratory Services Committee. Mm. And I don't sit on the committee, but I'm authorized to take part in their proceedings as what they call a industry liaison. Sounds cool. That's and when that laboratory services meeting meets, they decide which of these methods should stay and which should go as officially approved APCO methods. However, that does not necessarily get communicated to every state, because they're down the hallway in another meeting. Okay.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Wisconsin, my state of Wisconsin regulators, I've never seen one at an APCO meeting. Now, how they're going to
there somewhere? Come on, they got to be somewhere, right?
Yeah, when they met in Madison, Wisconsin in 2016, they were there when they hosted the meeting. Now, the issue here is communication. Okay, that's what I'm trying to point out. Yeah. Although state regulators all belong to the same group, and that group has said that only the ISO 19822 is the official APCO method for measuring the quantity of humic substances in fertilizer products, not everybody gets that message.
So assuming that this is the standard method that we all should be following, I mean, when we send a product in to be tested, what would you typically expect to see us be able to label as far as percentage of a humic substance, or what we'll call a humic acid for sake of argument, on our label? I mean, how high would you expect? And I say this in a way, in a Humic Products Trade Association standard of protecting the consumer. What would ideally, what are you going to see on a label? What would be the highest numbers? What would you expect?
Just to make sure we're clear, you're saying take one of your products that has humic acids, for example,
right,
in the product. Maybe we put in 5%, 10%. There's some number we put in. And you're asking me, how should that analyze out on a report?
Yeah. So when you go through the analysis in the laboratory, what am I going to be able to put on my label? Because it's not.
I hope it's zero. I hope the analysis comes back to zero.
But yeah, I mean, from a marketing standpoint, and I'll follow through with this, but from a marketing standpoint, I understand what you're saying. But from a scientific standpoint, what you're suggesting here is that humic substance that we're applying into this product is going to then react with the minerals that are in the product, be it potassium or calcium or whatever it is that product is focused on.
That's what we want it to do.
Yeah. So
in your products, that's what you are trying to achieve. You're trying to complex the humic materials with metals, calcium, magnesium, iron, anything that's in there. You want them to complex. But as soon as that happens, they are not necessarily detectable using the mild extraction techniques that fertilizer officials have approved.
Such as the methodology that California asks for.
Well, California in particular uses an analysis where it's not going to extract the humic acids out of the product, your product in this case, because they're complexed.
Right.
That's the intent. The intent is to complex them with everything that's in there to make that a better product. Well, if the humic acids were free and floating around, they're not doing anything.
They're not working. So if we see a product that says 30% humic acid, or I've seen some that say 85% humic acid, I mean, what are we supposed to believe in that scenario? I mean,
if that's a straight humic acids product and nothing else in it, no fertilizers, 12 to 14% is fairly typical of analysis for humic acids. I think I've seen as high as 17 in a liquid product, which is nothing but concentrated humic acids.
But you start bringing in minerals, calcium, magnesium, potassium, nitrogen, whatever it might be. Now that gets bound with those minerals, so that number is going to fall. If
nothing else, the humic acids are being diluted.
Right.
With water. Water has to accompany all these other ingredients in order to go into solution.
So you've been working. Well, let me make a disclaimer for those that are maybe be listening and don't know this. Lawrence is actually our chemist, and he does a lot of our formulation. So we've learned a lot of this, and we follow his model, which is the HPTA model. So it's been very frustrating because we do get a lot of folks, throwing the number game out. And the reality here is that it's not a numbers game. It's a complexing game. It's about how well is everything put together. And obviously it has to start with a qualified humic substance in order for that to really be effective in that. And as we go down the road here this morning, we'll talk about the value of these things in terms of biological buffering in the soil. But you've been working on a paper that talks about some of these products that are in the marketplace without divulging any unpublished secrets, if you're okay with this. I mean, what's this work about? I mean, this has been a perpetual problem. I know the HPTA has been battling it, but we see a lot of non-humic substances. And to qualify this, humic substances, or what everybody's calling humic acids, are really quite popular right now. You're seeing them in some of the biggest commercial fertilizer companies. And I think it's wonderful. I mean, these are some of the people that, 20 years ago when we first got into the business would say this is nothing but snake oil and criticize us to no end. And now you're seeing them come full circle, and it's their biggest branding pitch on granular fertilizers and liquid fertilizers. So it's becoming popular, but it's also becoming more confusing for the consumer, for the guys out there, the folks out there that are trying to determine, is this product really of quality? And there is, the name snake oil had a valid explanation back in the early days, because there was an awful lot of people using lignosulfonates and other things. But you've actually been diving into this a little deeper as far as, some of these not so valid humic substances. Is there any great secrets you can share with us on what you're discovering on this paper you're about to publish?
The paper is based upon an experience I had at a APCO regulatory meeting 4 years ago. Yeah. I've already stated that the ISO 19822 is validated for quantifying these humic. You're
going to get a tattoo with that somewhere, aren't you? The ISO 19822.
It goes by no other name.
I like that. I think that'd look good. I think you'd wear it well.
I was at an APCO meeting. It was in front of this group came forward. It was an industry that came forward to change the then current definition of humic substances, which is an official definition for fertilizer regulators. They can reference it. They can look it up. It's right in the APCO official publication. And this group said, we want to tag on 2 little words on the end of that definition. The definition says where these materials are usually sourced from. They're usually ancient deposits of organic material that's gone through a process that we call humification, which is very difficult to define, but that's what scientists say it has gone through. And they wanted to add right on the end of that sentence, and plants. And what that did was it opened the door for them to bring lignosulfonates into the marketplace, because they're plant derived. They don't go through the process of humification.
Explain what a lignosulfonate is.
A lignosulfonate is a derivative of the paper industry. They use sulfites to actually break down the lignin content in wood pulp materials. If you drive by one of these plants, oh my gosh, does it stink? They're using sulfides. And there's a kind of a liquid or a liquor left over, a very viscous, dark substance that looks like humic acids. And it's actually lignosulfonates, which are a byproduct of the paper industry. These materials are typically used for bindings, for pelletizing fertilizers. They're used in they're a feed ingredient for livestock feeds.
Why would they be a feed ingredient? Are they a carbon source?
They are a carbon source. They have some energy, and they chelate. They actually have the ability to complex with kind of similar to humified materials, but not the same. They have some capacity for that. But their biggest use is in the oil drilling industry and keeping dust down on roads. So it's obviously very cheap material.
The oil industry uses it in front of the drill bit to open up the holes a little bit.
It's used limited there. Humates actually work better in the oil industry than lignosulfonates. But they have a lot of uses. And when you look at the uses, they're fairly inexpensive materials. However, they are soluble in alkali and acids. Now, that is kind of the traditional definition of fulvic acid in the marketplace. The problem with that definition is it doesn't say where those highly soluble materials came from. It just says they're highly soluble. So it meets the definition of a highly soluble material. It's very dark. So they're typically used as fake products in the humic trade as fulvic acid, singular. That's always a red flag when I see that.
What, when you see the word or fulvic
When I see
acid,
fulvic
not
acid on a label, 36% fulvic acid, 96% completely soluble fulvic acid, these sort of things. If that were true, that bottle would be worth $1,000. So,
right.
because these fulvic acids are extremely difficult to isolate.
Tell the story without mentioning anybody's name, but you told us this the other day. You saw somebody at a trade show and he had a pile of material that he was claiming to be fulvic acid, and you went up to him and said, "This can't be fulvic acid." I mean, tell that story real quick.
Actually, it wasn't a trade show. I bought a bag of fulvic acid on the internet, a 1 pound bag for $40.
Oh.
I mean, very affordable stuff.
I got some land in Florida, in the swamplands, if you want.
It was guaranteed to be 94% soluble fulvic acid, singular. And I used that material as part of the study that you referred to as a great example of a fake fulvic acid in the marketplace.
Yeah.
Because the current ISO 19822 standard says if you want to figure out if it's fake, you analyze it for sulfur first. If it doesn't pass that sniff test, then you have to perform Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy.
Yeah, say that 3 times.
Hardly anybody has an FTIR access to that analytical procedure, especially regulatory labs. So it's kind of a loophole in the standard. The standard says, yeah, you can detect fake products using that ISO standard, but you need to go through very sophisticated procedures in order to figure out whether it's fake. So guess what? The regulatory labs, what they did with that standard, they didn't do that. So now these fulvic acid materials are still out there because regulators just don't have access to the sophisticated procedures required to even interpret FTIR analysis. So it created a bit of a problem. It didn't solve the big problem of keeping fake fulvic acid out of the marketplace. So that's why I did a 3-year study on developing a method that will detect legitimate humic materials from non-humic materials. And I can't make that claim yet because I just submitted it for publication yesterday.
But let me ask you this. If these lignosulfonates are sulfonated, wouldn't you be able to smell that?
You sure can.
All right. So if you had a lignosulfonate product or a product with what, I'm going to suggest you were referring to as not a legitimate humic substance, you would be able to smell the sulfur in there.
Right. But meat regulators can use what's called organoleptic inspection, sniff, literally sniff test. But fertilizer regulators do not recognize sniff testing as a standard analysis.
We feel miserably, I'm sure, at EarthWorks since we have such
where that works best is in the raw material that manufacturers use. So if you bring in a bag into the facility as an ingredient and it smells like a sulfide, then that's a big red flag. That's an issue. But what if a company purchased a material in good faith and then blended it into their products? Well, now you may not be able to detect that odor at that point.
Because it's diluted into a product.
Yeah. So this method that I'm proposing will protect manufacturers more than anybody. Eventually, the consumer, but the manufacturer would say, "How was this tested? Did it pass this test?" So forth and so on.
And I think that's a good point because we've certainly studied a lot of manufacturers' products, and I believe earnestly that a lot of these folks, maybe not everybody, but a lot of them are also being taken for a ride because they're being sold a bill of goods, or they just simply don't understand really what the value is. They just, everybody jumps on a bandwagon, which is why I
might mention that lignosulfonates do have some benefits.
Yes,
but certain people have decided to take a lignosulfonate and call it a fulvic acid.
Yeah.
So That's the issue.
Well,
Now,
let's have that conversation real quick. What's the difference between functionally in the soil, biologically, from a humic substance and a lignosulfonate? And you could even throw a biochar in there if you want, which has some great value as well.
right. They all have value. Yeah. Both of those have value.
Yeah.
Right. My complaint is don't call it a humic substance because
right.
You fetch a premium price then.
But a lignosulfonate will provide some value, such as what in the soil?
It does have the ability to complex. It has some complexing capacity. It's relatively inexpensive, so it could help make nutrients more bioavailable. I don't know if there's much research on that yet, but they certainly would appear to have that potential. Let's put it that way. And they're an excellent source of sulfate, so there's sulfur in them. Mm-hmm. They have the ability to. They are surfactants. They would be a anionic surfactant, so they have the ability to actually make water more miscible. So they do have some benefits.
And biochar, the same thing. They have some benefit. It's providing a housing mm-hmm. unit for the microbes in the soil. It's, mm-hmm. I mean, what else would a biochar do in a soil?
Yeah, biochar is quite good at containing or maintaining water levels in soils, actually capturing some water. They're very porous looking. If you ever see a scanning electron micrograph of one of them, they're very, very, it's not honeycombing. It's just, it's close like to little round places for everything to stick in, to stay in.
But comparing both of those to a humic or humic acid or humic substance, what's the real benefit of the humic substance over these other two?
But humic substances have an extremely high cation exchange capacity. So they're going to maintain cations in solution. They're going to maintain them in such a way that they kind of capture them, but also release them into the soil solution practically upon demand by either microbes or plant root exudates. They have the ability to complex, which means they can chelate, and that provides higher bioavailability. They have a tremendous water holding capacity. It's really huge. It's almost impossible to dry them down unless you finally grind them like in a
hammer mill.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking in the lab, we finally grind them down, put them in a crucible, put them in a drying furnace overnight, come back the next day, take it out, weigh it, put it back in the furnace, weigh it again. And if it doesn't weigh the same, they're not dry.
Right.
And it happens all the time. They have a tremendous water holding capacity.
This leads us to the real conversation of the day, which is this whole concept of biological buffering.
Yes.
I mean, especially in our industry, in the turf and ornamental, at golf course, sports fields, one of the biggest battles, and I've said this on this platform and pretty much in every lecture series that I ever give, is that one of the biggest limiting factors that a turf manager would have is managing sodium and or bicarbonates in the soil. Obviously, the sodium is going to deflocculate the soil. It's going to change physical structure, but it also is very detrimental to the biological environment that is so important. And that's really, the backbone of biological soil management is promoting the environment by which biology can proliferate. The humic substances are really integral in building that environment. But let's talk about that now in the soil and what, in light of some of these limiting factors like sodiums and other buildups that might occur in the soil. How much benefit is the humic substance going to bring to the table, and what's the best way for us to do that? Obviously, we're working together building liquids. We're also using granulars, which provides more volume, all of which have a humic substance part of the formulation. But let's get into the what's really happening now under our feet, and how do you start that conversation?
How do you start it? It started with life. Yeah, we don't do. I don't make pesticides, herbicides, I approach plants and growing things from what is life-giving. And if you are creating conditions that promote life to progress, and you end up with a healthier plant because the plant takes up a balance of nutrients. We got to get into this. Buffering is like the word balance when you look at it biologically.
Yeah, I use the word buffering, and I'm not sure it's being fully understood. So that's kind of what I'm hoping to be able to accomplish here.
I think most people's perception of buffering is pH buffering.
Right.
That's one of many types of buffering, but pH is a good example. Living things all survive within some narrow range of pH. It might be acid, it might be alkaline, but most things are right around 6.8. They like 6.8. So at 6.8, most things will grow and grow very well, a majority of plants. Okay. Mm-hmm. But how does that 6.8 end up there? We try to control it with chemicals, but biology will actually release whatever it has to, an acid or an alkaline. Let's say a root exudate, for example, will release whatever it takes to buffer the pH, for example, just pH, because it knows that not only is it happy at that pH, but it makes the microbes happy also. Right. And they will provide food or exudates, and even these microbes appear to sacrifice themselves through the root growing meristem on the root actually consumes microbes in the soil, extracts nutrients, puts the microbes, I don't know how it does this, nobody knows how it does this, puts the microbes back out in the soil again.
You're talking of rhizophagy that we've talked about.
Yeah, rhizophagy.
And this is work that was done by Dr. White at Rutgers, and he's well documented. In fact, he's been on the speaking circuit, was recently at an Acres USA meeting in California talking about it, that Kevin Hicks, our agronomist, had a chance to listen to it. He said it was fascinating how the microbiology is actually drawn into the plant. The plant then extracts the mineral that the microbe is kind of carrying with it, and then it spits the microbe back out into the soil alive. And if we can encourage a really aggressive microbiological environment around that meristem, around that root, this rhizophagy cycle can really proliferate. And that's really what biological soil management is all about, right?
Yes, and the end product of these complex processes that take place in the soil system is what we call organic matter.
Right.
And my awareness of that started with this book right here. Can you see that?
I can't see that. I have that somewhere in this room, I think.
Okay. Soil Organic Matter. This is by...
What's the name of the book? Because nobody's watching this. They just...
Soil Organic Matter in Sustainable Agriculture.
And the author is?
It's actually edited. There are numerous authors. Yeah. It's edited by Mag, Doff, and Wheel, W-E-I-L. Chapter 7 is written by Larry Phelan from Ohio. What is it, State University? And
it is Ohio State. Yeah.
The name of the chapter is Connecting Below Ground and Above Ground Food Webs.
Yeah.
And in that chapter, he introduced the term biological buffering. And he quotes in here that this idea was presented by Howard in 1943. So, and he quotes Howard as saying that all these things that are in what they didn't call it the food web back then are actually controlled by the presence of organic matter. And the most complex form of organic matter, the most stable form of organic matter, are humic substances. So humic substances in natural systems are the end product of biological activity.
Yes.
The biology provides its own environment by producing humic substances that are very stable. It doesn't break them down any further. It utilizes them as materials where they can perform all these interchanges and store water and detoxify waste products. It's a kind of an endless list of what humic substances do in soil systems.
And that's what you're referring to when you're using the word buffering, is it's detoxifying, right. It's managing.
If you looked at a natural soil system, like in a forest,
yeah,
where things are in balance, obviously, most of the time.
Most part, yeah.
Most part. you extract the water soil solution out of a forest soil, you can measure the quantities of nitrogen, phosphorus, nitrates, and ammonium can be measured. You can measure all the micronutrients. You can measure the sulfur. You can measure all that. And it's always in millimoles per liter,
Right.
which is
Which we don't understand. What the hell does that mean?
That's 1,000th of the molecular weight of whatever you're measuring nitrogen. Okay, it's 1,000th of 14 molecular weight. Did I get that right? Yes, I got it right.
He's checking his scale, yes, on the wall.
Yeah. So that's not a lot. And then we come along and we pour on, let's say, urea, and urea dissolves humic substances. It dissolves organic matter. So we destroy our high inputs of nitrogen are destructive to that system that's so beautifully orchestrated and organized in nature.
And let me qualify that just so that I don't get into trouble a whole lot here. There's, urea is a valuable tool, but it has to be balanced.
It has to be applied in extremely low rates in order to be ecologically balanced.
And you need to be going 2 steps forward and only taking that 1/2 step backwards to make that really work. But if you're on a diet of urea, you're going to burn out that soil. You're going to take it away from a nitrification standpoint, and you're going to damage the humic substances in that soil profile. And imagine if you start in a soil that is sand-based and it doesn't have a lot of organic matter to begin with, and that's part of the argument that we have here is that, well, we don't have it anyway, so why not just use urea? It's a sand-based system. But, it's funny. I had a conversation yesterday with a golf course superintendent in the mid-Atlantic here in the Northeast, who had just done a grow-in, and he has used very little nitrogen because he really incorporated a lot of, carbon-based, mineral-based amendments in his grow-in. And even consultants that were coming by were looking at this and saying, wow, this is fascinating. How did you do this? And he added, he added Renovate Plus and Mycorrhizae and Myco Replenish, some other goodies like that. And he's consistently added food sources to supply, food substances to microbiology, and it can be done, and it is being done.
Yeah, my training, my background, my hands-on training, street smarts, whatever you want to call it, came from Gary Zimmer, who has an organic farm just a couple of miles down the road from me, and he applies 0 nitrogen. His corn yields, his alfalfa yields, his rye yield now, and his wheat yields exceed the averages for the state of Wisconsin.
That's heresy, that. That's a bunch of crap.
With no nitrogen inputs, because he does what he calls growing his own by encouraging the nitrogen-fixing bacteria that are already in the soils, and there's a lot of them and a lot of variety of them, by encouraging that biological system with low inputs and balancing his inputs with what he sees on a soil test. He's extremely successful, and he sets the standard. He is the model for regenerative, what do they call it? Regenerative agriculture. Gone through a number of names recently. Used to be called eco-ag. And
regenerative agriculture. Tell the story about when you're standing on his farm compared to his neighbor's farm that's farmed conventional.
Well, between Gary and I there's a conventional farm, high input, yet really intensive input conventional farm. They're out there putting everything and anything on, then fighting it off with herbicides and pesticides in the meantime. And we went through a drought in 2014 here, and I photographed this, and I made a couple of presentations. I stood right by the barbed wire fence, right at the property line, took a picture of the conventional farm leaves all shriveled up, pointing straight up into the sky, and just really sickly looking plants, and just step over the line and aim the camera at Gary's crops. Beautiful crops, in balance, bright green. Just wonderful sight.
This is not a phenomenon that is uncommon in the regenerative agriculture community. Joel Salatin, over my shoulder here is a book called Kiss the Ground. And if you haven't seen the movie, take a look at that. It really talks about how carbon-based fertility, how biological soil management can build a soil. Gabe Brown's featured in there, and he does the same thing. His farm was almost lost. He was conventional. He was encouraged to go a more regenerative function, and he stands on the edge of his farm, and his neighbor, who is in a semi-arid area and conventional, it looks like desert, and his property looks lush and green. Joel Salatin says the same thing, who's very popular in Acres USA, and people stand on hilltops over his property during the drought and think he's stealing water from the river because his soils are holding moisture. And we see that even in these constructed soils in the turf and ornamental industry, is that we can see the buildup of humus and water holding capacity and mineral holding capacity, and this improvement of biology and all this stuff. Let's talk a little bit about how these functions effectively, I'm going to go back to this word buffering, buffer out things like sodium and bicarbonates. I mean, one of the things that we talk a lot about with you is how do we fight this battle of sodium and bicarbonate and what it's doing to the plant material with these types of complex formulas, and the formulas that you have been building with us have been very complex. I mean, obviously we're using multiple forms of humic substances, and depending on, and you can get into this if you'd like, but depending on where the mineral base is, we might shift the humic substance from a fulvic to a humic, or a combination based on pH and what we're trying to accomplish. But how does that work in the soil in terms of buffering and grabbing and sequestering things like sodium?
Yeah, going back to my example of forest soils, you can measure the NP and K in these soils and the micronutrients, and you come up with a number. But how did it get there in the first place?
Exactly.
Nobody went out there and said, "Oh, we need a pound of this and 3 pounds of that, per acre." That was not the case. It is obvious by studying nature that there's something in these systems that can buffer out the negative effects of too much sodium, for example. And give you an even stronger example, aluminum with a charge of 3 on it. It's highly toxic to almost everything on the face of the earth except some flowers that need it and blueberries. But aluminum,
in very low pHs where it's toxic.
Yeah, the lower the pH, usually you see the aluminum protons appearing in high concentration, and that's measured. That contributes to the pH measurement. But humics, here we go again. Humic substances can actually lock onto aluminum and lock it up and pull it out of these systems. And how did we get the humic substances there to do that marvelous job of detoxifying aluminum or sodium? They got produced by biological activity. That's where they came from. So it all comes back to biology sooner or later. Not how much of this you put in or how much of that you put in, but whether that system is naturally buffering itself through biological activity.
One of the things that was common and probably still is when there's a toxicity in a soil, folks will use charcoal, activated charcoal, and explain how that might work and be different than what a humic substance might do for the same reason.
They have that charcoal has the ability of adsorption, which means it can pull things out of solutions and make them actually kind of stick to their surface. It's a surface phenomena. It's not a chemical phenomena. It's just surface activity. And humic substances also have that ability to a higher degree, more so than charcoal. And charcoal is renowned for detoxifying humans, animals, anybody that's come into a toxin because of that adsorption phenomena. It's a physical phenomena of surface chemistry.
This is going to get a little creepy, perhaps, but I'm known for that. You and I take a humic substance product often.
Yeah.
From our friend Andy, that does a lot of that in our own bodies, in our gut and our stomach. I mean, we take a little capsule that's got some of Jerry Brunetti's clay and a humic substance in it. And it
Yes.
really, I swear by it. When I have a sour stomach, I will, take a couple of these capsules, and man, it starts to absorb a lot of stuff out of it. I mean, I assume the same thing is happening pretty much in the soil in that regard from a limited toxicity standpoint.
Yeah, that was intended to kind of duplicate what happens in the digestive system of soils.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And when you think about it, soil is the stomach of this whole system, and that's really what we're doing. So when you're using a humic substance, you're dealing with a lot of, and a lot of the folks that we're working with in our industry are constantly being inundated with sodium because their water is high in sodium. And obviously that's their biggest single input. So every time they turn on that irrigation system, they're dousing that soil with more and more and more sodium and or more bicarbonates. It's those types of environments where these kind of programs are most important. Of course, the problem with that is also that they need more and more, which ultimately becomes fairly expensive. But in order to survive that influx of that, persistent sodium, that biology needs to really be fed and encouraged, right?
Yeah, we've seen how biological buffering will allow crops to go through drought stress much better than high salt inputs can possibly pull off. Well, they can't do it. Simple. So this, to me, has an obvious application in turf for water use efficiency. It's got to translate out into using less water. Yeah. And the water seems to be the problem of sodium and bicarbonates, so we can cut that down a wee bit, probably. And so the benefits are much greater than just holding on to water, for example. We got that sodium problem that we can actually reduce, and the bicarbonate problem. And when we develop a product, we try to make sure there are very, very little, if any, sodium or bicarbonates in any of these products, so we don't add to the problem.
You brought up water, and water is clearly going to be one of the biggest concerns in the next, century, in the next 10, 20 years. I mean, I've been listening to reports and TV shows and podcasts on the Colorado River, and it's nothing but dread. It's almost gone. And a lot of it, I listened to a report from a scientist on this not long ago. He was talking about how a lot of it is going because conventional farmers are growing very water intensive crops like forage hays and alfalfa in the semi-arid and drawing in all that water. In fact, it was interesting. They even said, this scientist that was working on this even said that if we give up meat one day a week and allow farmers to grow less alfalfa or less forage hay because of that, we would save an exorbitant amount. I've forgotten, unfortunately, the number that he gave, but he had it all documented out how much water would be saved. And when you see farms like Gary's and like Gabe Brown's or Joel Salatin's, or even some of the golf courses that we work with that have gotten a really strong biological soil management profile, you see them using less water and certainly see them using less fertilizer. I mean, that's all because we're starting to regenerate biological activity. I mean, it's all about biology.
I used to own a couple of car washes, and whenever self-service, and whenever drought came around, it was one of the first things to get shut down because you're using water to wash a car. We need this water to drink. So what's going to happen in the future for the golf course industry when the public says we need this water to drink? And it's not proper to put it on a grass.
We've seen this in California where they're
watering lawns, for example. Yeah.
People, they're turning water off in the rough. They're turning it off in the fairway. I mean, there was a classic case, and I won't mention any names, but a really wonderful golf course in Northern California that was in the middle of growing, and they got their water cut back. And obviously in growing situations, you need a lot of water, and they suffered because of that. I think these are scenarios that are going to continue to happen. I mean, here on the East Coast this year, we were 90 plus days without water. As I'm sitting here, it's pouring, but from June until today, we really haven't had any rain. And our river is like down to 2 feet where it's normally at 6 or 7, which makes it very difficult for us to kayak. But you can see those kind of visual things, and by getting these products into a soils program. And I think that's why you're seeing so many changes, so many conventional companies coming to, first of all, a humic substance is making their fertilizer work better, but it's also helping to regenerate the soils a little bit. Let's talk about, liquids in general. The way we use liquids is small but frequent applications. Certainly the formulas that you and I have worked on here at EarthWorks are very complex. We have as many as 30 raw ingredients in some of these, which makes it very difficult for you having to really balance these soils, these products, and keep them stable. But you've been working on what we're calling what are we calling this now?
Eco-adaptive
technology. Actually, sorry, I should know this. It's ingrained. But it's been fascinating because you've shown me the charts as you've modified some of these products where certain elements were spiking and certain elements were falling off. And what you've done is you've brought them all into balance. And in the little bit of time we have left, let's talk a little bit about the value of these liquid products. But let's understand what eco-adaptive chemistry and the work that you've been doing in bringing those spikes and valleys and bringing everything into balance. Explain that to us in a way that might make sense to somebody that's not a chemist.
It's kind of based on a relatively simple principle. For example, many in your audience probably realize that in order to move sodium off of a soil colloid, you increase the amount of potassium in the soil system. Well, if you look at the periodic table, it makes perfect sense because they're right next to each other, and elements on the periodic table that are right next to each other tend to compete on soil colloids. So if you raise calcium will displace sodium. It'll actually, it'll complement potassium up to a degree, and then it'll compete with potassium. So there's obviously some kind of chemical balance that nature has figured out. And when I was referring back to those forest soils, how we can extract the liquid portion of a forest soil, you can measure the quantities of all these nutrients that are in a naturally balanced system. And I use that as a model of what would a ecologically balanced soil look like. Then plug that data into that graphing system that you mentioned. And if something is out of ecological balance, it spikes up on the graph. So then either reducing it or increasing its counterpart. Like, let's say my sodium is spiking on the graph. So I'll increase the potassium and you'll see that graph come down. Yeah, because those interactions do exist. They're well documented. Any chemist knows that when you're working with these materials in a lab, you know what the interactions are. They're very familiar with these interactions. So why not apply that to the ecological conditions that exist in soil? So that's kind of the principle of it. And I sent you a message yesterday. What does a balanced fertilizer look like in your best?
I wasn't sure I knew how to answer that.
Well, you hear it all the time.
Over the years.
Our fertilizers are balanced. This is balanced. Well, could you please define that? So you said maybe a 10-10-10.
That's what I remember from my days. And I'm going to age myself in the 70s when I was in college. 10-10-10 is the best fertilizer. Like, really? Then you get out in the real world and you start to understand how a soil works and you realize that's horrible. But anyway.
I plugged it into my. As soon as I got your message,
I thought you would.
I could see a huge conflict between potassium and nitrogen based upon a balance of 10-10-10 on a label. So obviously it's not balanced ecologically. And then I played around with it last night until I came up with a nitrogen number that would work in what I would call an eco-adaptive approach to fertilization. And it hit a maximum of 7% nitrogen on the label guarantee.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, the chemistry is amazing. And, you brought up calcium, which is only going to get me into trouble with my friend Travis. because he doesn't like when I talk about it. But it's interesting to see the whole balance concept within the formulation of these types of products. And part of what Eco-Adaptive is doing, and we've already started to see this in the field, is it's making the nutrients more available. And you're always spinning my head because, you know, every time you make them more available, we tend to use less. So our analysis tends to go down, but our availability goes up, which is counterproductive, and it really messes me up from a marketing standpoint. But I think
marketing, yes, but chemistry, no.
Well, let's see, what's more important, marketing or chemistry? So
I think any chemist could look at this proposition and say, "Oh, yeah, that's exactly what happens every day."
And that's really what we've been trying to do since Jerry, got us into this thing. And obviously, I'm referring to Jerry Brunetti, who was my founding partner. But, it's always been about biological soil management, about getting more efficiency. And that doesn't mean necessarily, and in fact, it clearly doesn't mean more nutrient. It means a better mechanism by which to get the nutrient into the plant. And that's where, 30 raw materials in a jug, including a lot of good quality ISO 19822 approved humic substances are going to help make the nutrients get into the plant.
That chapter on biological balancing.
Yeah, I might have to reread that.
Has some beautiful 3D graphs in it showing.
Might have to steal those.
Showing what happens to insect pressure as you change the level of 3 nutrients, for example. And I talked to Larry Phelan one day and I said, "What nutrients did you use?" He said, "It didn't matter. Just pick 3 nutrients."
Oh, really?
There's a point on that graph that really influenced me on my work. There's a point on that graph where insect pressure pretty well goes away because the nutrients are now in balance.
That's heresy, you know that.
And it produces a healthy plant. And then the plant's energy shifts from growth, high nitrogen, shifts from growth to producing complete proteins instead of incomplete proteins. Insects do not feast on complete proteins and complex carbohydrates.
They feast on what Jerry would call funny proteins or unconstructed amino acids, which is
it's not even a protein. It's incomplete. It's more or less amino acids.
Yeah. Well, I hate to tell you this.
That work supports Jerry Brunetti's hypothesis.
Exactly. Yeah,
right there.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Well, I hate to tell you, but we have run out of time. I will be more than happy to pay for and get you a reference for a good tattoo artist to get you that ISO 19822 across your shoulder or your back. I think that'd be a good look on you. But I appreciate all your work that you've done for us. We are actually making big changes here in terms of eco-adaptive chemistry, and it's not been without its challenges, has it? I mean, we've had our growing pains, but we're very confident that as we get better and better at this, and it's 35 years of doing this, and we're still trying to get better, and we're learning. I mean, it's amazing that we still see new ideas coming out. Rhizophagy is relatively new concept. Glomalin, mycorrhiza's substrate that came out, it wasn't even really discovered until the mid 90s. So there's an awful lot for us to learn. I mean, I think we're at the very beginning stages of the understanding of biology, but I'm encouraged because certainly more of our clients are seeing what the benefit of a good biological profile are in terms of, better growth, better recovery, and all those kind of things. And, and as obviously we keep our ears open to the industry talking about regenerative agriculture, there's new things coming out all the time. And the work you're doing with humic substances, I think is very much part of that forefront. So I thank you for all you have done. I thank you for the hour plus that you have given me. I know you've got to run, but we will have you back again and again and again, because you make me giggle and you spin my head, which is really important. And if I don't have my head spinning, I think I'm going to just sit there on the couch watching old reruns. So thank you, my friend, very much.
You're welcome.
And that is the EarthWorks podcast. We will be back next week. Please subscribe so that we can get you information before it comes out, and you can hear who's coming up, like fascinating folks like Lawrence Mayhew. And again, Lawrence, thank you so much, and we'll be in touch very soon.